My greedy boss ordered me to stay on a 3-story roof during a severe lightning storm. When I climbed down to save my own life, he fired me on the spot and forced a desperate young father up there instead. Minutes later, a lightning strike killed the young man. Then my boss tried to frame me for the death, so I set an inescapable trap that destroyed his entire empire. Before this story continues, tell me where are you watching from today and what's the temperature? Drop it in the comments below, because the chilling betrayal you are about to hear will make your blood run absolutely cold. You don't spend 30 years on a roof without learning how to read the sky. By 2 o'clock that Tuesday afternoon, the air over Mrs. Gable's 3-story Victorian estate had turned completely stagnant. It was that heavy, a suffocating kind of humidity that makes your lungs work twice as hard for half the oxygen. I was 56 years old. My knees were wrapped in the thick neoprene braces, and the sweat was stinging my eyes so badly I could barely see the edge of the shingles. But it wasn't the heat that had the hair on the back of my neck standing up. It was the sudden drop in atmospheric pressure. I could feel it in my joints. "Keep tearing it off, boys. We are not losing this daylight," barked Greg Bull Miller, our site foreman. Bull was a sycophant, a heavy-set man who spent more time kissing up to the company owner than he did holding a hammer. He stood on the 2nd-story scaffolding, leaning over the safety rail, shouting up at my crew. We were working a brutal 10-12 pitch roof, which meant it was steep enough that one wrong step would send you sliding down 3 stories into Mrs. Gable's immaculate rose bushes. I drove my tear-off shovel under a stubborn row of architectural shingles, ripping the rusted nails from the decking with a loud wooden groan. I paused, wiping my brow with the back of my leather glove, and looked toward the western horizon. The clouds over the distant tree line weren't just gray. They were the color of a bruised plum, churning and rolling with violent energy. "Bull, we've got a cell moving in fast," I shouted down over the noise of the compressor. "We need to start tarping the ridge. It's going to get ugly in about 20 minutes. "You aren't paid to be a meteorologist, Joseph." A new, sharper voice cut through the humid air. I looked down to the driveway. Vince Cutler had just pulled up in his spotless $80,000 Ford Raptor. Vince was the owner of Cutler Contracting. He was a man in his early 40s who wore custom-tailored polo shirts to construction sites and wore a watch that cost more than I made in 2 full years of manual labor. He valued his profit margins above everything else on this earth, and human safety was merely a frustrating obstacle to his bottom line. Vince slammed his truck door and pointed a perfectly manicured finger up at me. "The lumber yard is dropping off the new bundles in an hour. I want that underlayment exposed by the time they get here. No excuses." "Vince, look at the sky," I yelled back, stepping carefully along the roof jacks. "It's a thunderstorm. We're 3 stories up holding metal poles. Oh, we are giant lightning rods right now. Are you refusing to work, Pendleton?" Vince crossed his arms, his face turning an angry shade of red. "Because I have a dozen guys who would happily take your paycheck today." A low, deep rumble of thunder rolled across the valley, vibrating through the wooden decking right into the soles of my work boots. The wind suddenly picked up, shifting from a hot breeze to a chilling gust that carried the distinct, metallic scent of ozone. The leaves on the massive oak tree beside the house turned inside out, flashing their pale bellies. I had survived 3 decades in this dangerous industry by trusting my gut, and right now, my gut was screaming. The storm wasn't just coming, it was already here. I looked at the 3 younger guys on my crew. They were looking at me, terrified, waiting for the old man to make the call. "Drop your shovels," I told them quietly. "Grab the tarps. We are getting off this roof right now." The temperature dropped 10 degrees in the span of 3 minutes. The wind began to howl around the gables of the old Victorian house, flapping the heavy blue tarps like giant sails as my crew desperately tried to staple them over the exposed wood. Crack! A flash of lightning illuminated the bruised sky, followed almost instantly by a deafening clap of thunder. It was less than 2 miles away. "Leave it!" I roared over the wind, grabbing the shoulder of a young roofer named Mark. "Get to the ladders, now!" I ushered the 3 young men to the aluminum extension ladders, watching their boots carefully until they were safely on the scaffolding below. Once I was sure they were clear, and I grabbed my tool belt, clipped it around my waist, and swung my legs over the edge. I climbed down as the first heavy freezing drops of rain began to pelt the side of the house. When my boots finally hit the soft grass of the front lawn, I turned around to find Vince standing right in my face, shielding himself with a large golf umbrella. Bull stood right behind him, looking like a loyal guard dog. "What do you think you're doing, Joseph?" Vince demanded, his voice trembling with absolute rage. "I did not authorize a work stoppage. We are already a day behind on this contract." "It's an active lightning storm, Vince," I yelled back, the rain now matting my gray hair to my forehead. OSHA regulations clearly state that all rooftop work must cease when lightning is within 10 miles. I'm not risking my life or the lives of these kids for a deadline. Vince stepped closer, his expensive cologne mixing with the smell of wet asphalt and rain. "You don't quote regulations to me. I own this company. I give the orders. Now get your boots back on that ladder. Get up there and finish securing those tarps before the water ruins the drywall inside." "No," I said, my voice steady and completely unwavering. "It's a death trap up there." Vince's eyes narrowed into tiny, furious slits. "Then you're done. You're fired, Joseph. Pack up your tools and get off my site. Don't even bother asking for your final check until Friday." Before I could respond, an old, rusted sedan pulled into the driveway behind Vince's gleaming truck. A young man stepped out into the pouring rain. He looked to be in his late 20s, soaking wet, and wearing clothes that had seen far too many miles, and work boots that were held together by duct tape. I knew his face. His name was Mateo Vargas. He was a day laborer who had been coming around the supply yards looking for any scraps of work to feed his family. Mateo approached us timidly, pulling his soaked jacket tight around his thin frame. "Mr. Cutler, sir? They told me at the yard you might need extra hands today. I am a very hard worker. Please, I need the hours." Vince looked from me to Mateo, a cruel, calculating smile spreading across his face. "Well, it's your lucky day, kid," Vince said loudly, making sure I heard every word. "A position just opened up. You want to work? You want to get paid today?" "Yes, sir. Anything. I have a little girl at home," Mateo pleaded, his voice thick with a heavy accent and desperate hope. "See that roof?" Vince pointed his umbrella up at the 3-story peak, now obscured by a torrential downpour and roaring wind. "There are 3 loose tarps up there. Go secure them. Do that, and you have a full-time job." "Mateo, don't do it!" I lunged forward, grabbing the young man's wet sleeve. "It's a metal ridge. The lightning is right on top of us." Vince shoved his arm between us, breaking my grip. "Back off, Pendleton. You're trespassing now. Mateo, if you want this job, you climb that ladder right now. If you don't, I'll make sure no contractor in this county ever hires you. What's it gonna be?" Mateo looked at me, his dark eyes filled with a heartbreaking mixture of apology and sheer panic. He needed the money. He couldn't afford to say no. Without a word to me, Mateo turned, ran through the pouring rain, and began to climb the slick, wet aluminum ladder toward the sky. I stood in the torrential rain, entirely ignoring the fact that my clothes were soaked through to my skin. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the ladder. My chest tightened with a suffocating sense of dread as I watched Mateo's small frame ascend the 3 stories. He moved cautiously, his duct tape boots slipping twice on the wet aluminum rungs. "Vince, call him down!" I screamed over the roaring wind, turning to face my former boss. "You're going to get him killed! The ridge vent is solid aluminum. Get off my property before I call the cops, Joseph." Vince sneered from the dry sanctuary beneath his massive golf umbrella. He checked his expensive watch, completely indifferent to the human life he had just ordered into the storm. Bull stood beside him, and nervously shifting his weight, but saying nothing to stop the madness. I didn't leave. I ran to my beat-up work truck parked on the street, threw open the door, and grabbed my heavy-duty air horn from the center console. I planned to blast it, to signal an absolute emergency and force Mateo to climb back down, regardless of what Vince said. But as I slammed the truck door shut and turned back toward the house, the sky tore open. It happened so fast that my brain couldn't process the sequence of events until later. 1 second, I saw Mateo crest the edge of the roof, his hand reaching out to grab the heavy plastic tarp flapping violently in the wind. The next second, the world turned blindingly, violently white. There was no thunder, not at first. There was just a pure, searing flash of light that erased everything else, accompanied by a sound like a massive bomb detonating right inside my eardrums. The sheer force of the shockwave knocked me backward against the side of my truck. My teeth rattled, and a sharp, metallic taste flooded my mouth. The air suddenly smelled overwhelmingly of burnt hair and vaporized copper. As my vision swam back into focus through the purple spots dancing in my eyes, the delayed, deafening crack of thunder finally rolled over us. Shaking the ground so hard, the car alarms down the street began to blare in unison. I looked up at the roof. The spot where Mateo had been standing was smoking. The edge of the blue tarp was blackened and melting, hissing loudly in the heavy rain. But Mateo wasn't there. "No," I whispered, the word lost in the howling wind. "No, no, no." I sprinted across the flooded lawn, my boots sinking into the mud. I rounded the corner of the house, pushing past the scaffolding. Mateo lay crumpled in the middle of Mrs. Gable's manicured rose bushes. He was entirely still. His work jacket was scorched and smoking on the left shoulder. The fabric fused to his skin. His duct tape boots had been completely blown off his feet by the electrical exit charge. "Call 911, I screamed, dropping to my knees right into the thorny branches, completely ignoring the sharp pain as thorns tore into my forearms. I reached for his neck, frantically searching for a pulse. His skin was unnaturally hot to the touch, feeling like a radiator left running too long. There was no pulse. His chest wasn't moving. I started doing chest compressions right there in the mud, pressing down hard, screaming at him to wake up, screaming at the sky, screaming at God. Rain poured down my face, mixing with the tears I didn't realize I was shedding. I heard footsteps splashing in the mud behind me. I looked over my shoulder. Vince had walked over, his umbrella still perfectly positioned over his head. He looked down at Mateo's lifeless body, then looked at the smoking roof. He didn't look sad. He didn't look horrified. Vince looked incredibly inconvenienced. "Bull," Vince said, his voice cold and terrifyingly calm. "Go to the truck. Get the company logbook. I need you to write down that Joseph was the acting foreman today and that he was the one who gave the orders to stay on the roof. Do it right now before the cops arrive." I stopped my compressions for a fraction of a second, staring up at the man in utter disbelief. He wasn't trying to save a life. He was already building his alibi. The wail of police sirens pierced through the rhythmic hammering of the rain long before the flashing red and blue lights illuminated Mrs. Gable's driveway. I hadn't stopped chest compressions once, my shoulders burning with exhaustion, my wet hair plastered to my forehead, my breath coming in jagged, desperate gasps. The mud around Mateo's lifeless body had turned into a thick, soupy mess, stained slightly pink where the rose thorns had torn his arms during the fall. "Step back, sir. Let us take over," shouted a young paramedic, dropping a heavy orange bag into the mud beside me. I was practically tackled off Mateo by a police officer who pulled me up by my soaked jacket. I stumbled back, my chest heaving, the metallic taste of ozone still thick on my tongue. I watched the paramedics frantically tear open Mateo's scorched shirt, applying defibrillator pads to his chest. The monitor let out a long, flat whine that cut through the pouring rain like a knife. "Clear!" the paramedic yelled. Mateo's body jerked violently on the wet grass. The monitor remained a flat, terrifying line. I turned away, unable to watch the violent reality of a life extinguished so brutally. My eyes immediately found Vince Cutler. He was standing safely beneath the large awning of Mrs. Gable's front porch, completely dry, casually talking on his cell phone. He looked like a man ordering a pizza, not a man whose employee had just been struck by 1,000,000 volts of electricity. Beside him, Bull was scribbling furiously into the company logbook, just as Vince had ordered him to do. "Wait, are you the foreman on this job site?" a deep voice asked from behind me. I turned around to see a tall, broad-shouldered man in a tan trench coat holding a small notepad. He looked to be in his mid-40s, with a sharp jawline and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. "Detective Russo," he said, flashing a badge quickly before tucking it away from the rain. What the hell happened here? Before I could answer, Vince stepped off the porch and jogged over to us, closing his golf umbrella with a snap. "Detective, I'm Vince Cutler, owner of the company," Vince said, his voice dripping with practiced, mournful sincerity. "It's a terrible tragedy. Absolutely devastating. My foreman here, Joseph Pendleton, made a terrible judgment call today. He insisted on pushing the crew through the storm to meet a deadline. I wasn't even here when he forced that poor kid up on the roof." My jaw dropped. The sheer audacity of the lie was so massive it briefly paralyzed my brain. I stared at Vince, then back to Detective Russo. That is an absolute lie, I said, my voice trembling with rage. I ordered my crew off that roof 20 minutes ago. I told him it was a death trap. Vince fired me on the spot for refusing to work in the lightning. He was the one who hired Mateo right out of his car and threatened him to get up there. Vince shook his head sadly, putting a hand on his chest. Joseph, I know you're in shock, buddy, but lying to the police isn't going to bring that boy back. I have my site supervisor right here who can verify everything. Bull stepped forward from the porch, holding out the logbook. His hands were shaking slightly. Oui, but his voice was loud and clear. It's true, Detective. Joseph has been pushing the guys all week. He was acting foreman today. He gave the orders. He wouldn't let anyone come down until the tarps were secured. You lying coward! I lunged at Bull, my hands outstretched, aiming right for his throat. 2 uniformed officers grabbed me instantly, twisting my arms painfully behind my back and slamming me face first against the side of a wet police cruiser. The cold metal bit into my cheek as I struggled against their grip, screaming at Vince, screaming at Bull, screaming at the injustice of it all. Calm down, Mr. Pendleton, Detective Russo barked, stepping right into my line of sight. Or you'll be leaving here in handcuffs. Do you understand me? I stopped fighting, my chest heaving against the cold car door. I nodded slowly. Maybe they let me go, but kept a firm grip on my shoulders. I have the company logbook right here, Detective, Vince said softly, holding up the small black notebook. It clearly states Joseph was the designated safety officer and foreman for today's shift. He signed in this morning. The responsibility for site safety falls entirely on him. I felt the blood drain entirely from my face. I had signed that book at 6 a.m., just like I did every morning, acknowledging my role for the day. But Vince was taking that signature and turning it into a murder weapon. He was building an ironclad alibi out of a routine paperwork procedure, shifting the entire legal and moral weight of Mateo's death squarely onto my shoulders. The next 48 hours were a living nightmare. The storm finally broke the following morning. Leaving the town washed clean, but my life was irreparably stained. The news of Mateo's death hit the local papers by Wednesday evening. The headline of the Daily Sentinel read, "Local roofer killed by lightning strike. Foreman's negligence suspected." I sat at my small kitchen table on Thursday morning, staring blankly at the front page. My daughter, Sarah, sat across from me, her laptop open, scrolling frantically through the online comments. Sarah was 32, a pragmatic and fierce paralegal who possessed none of my passive patience and all of my late wife's fiery stubbornness. "Dad, this is a coordinated attack," Sarah said, pointing a rigid finger at the screen. "Vince has already released a public statement to the press. He's claiming Cutler Contracting is deeply grieving, and that they are cooperating fully with OSHA and the police to investigate rogue actions taken by a rogue employee. He's throwing you entirely under the bus." "I know, Sarah," I muttered, rubbing my face exhaustedly. I hadn't slept since the accident. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mateo's boots blowing off his feet. He owns the logbook. He owns Bull. It's my word against his, and he's got the money to make his word the truth. The phone rang suddenly, making us both jump. Sarah grabbed it, her eyes narrowing as she listened. "Yes, he's here. No, he will not be making a statement right now. Who is this?" She paused, her face pale. "I see. Thank you for the heads up." She hung up the phone and looked at me, her expression grim. "That was a friend from the courthouse," Sarah said softly. "Yes, OSHA just opened an official fatality investigation, and Vince's lawyers have already filed a preliminary injunction against you, claiming you violated company policy. They are setting you up to take the full fall for involuntary manslaughter, Dad. If the district attorney decides to press charges based on Vince's logbook, you could go to prison for a very long time." A cold, heavy stone settled into the pit of my stomach. Vince wasn't just trying to avoid a fine. He was trying to ruin my life to save his own empire. "We need a lawyer," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't have the money to fight a man who buys $80,000 trucks for fun." Sarah closed her laptop with a sharp snap. "We don't just need a lawyer, Dad. We need evidence. A logbook is just paper. Now, it doesn't prove who said what in that driveway. We need to prove Vince was there, that he fired you, and that he forced Mateo up that ladder. It was pouring rain, Sarah. The only people in that driveway were me, Mateo, Vince, and Bull. Mateo is dead, and Bull is a bought and paid for liar. There are no witnesses. Then we make our own luck, Sarah said, standing up and grabbing her car keys. You are not going down for a rich man's crime. Get your coat. We are going back to Mrs. Gable's house. Why? I asked, confused. The police already taped off the scene. OSHA is there right now. We can't go near it. We aren't going to the scene, Sarah replied, her eyes flashing with a dangerous determination. We are going to talk to the neighbors, and someone had to have seen or heard something before that lightning struck. The drive back to the affluent neighborhood where Mrs. Gable lived was agonizing. The skies were completely clear, a mocking, brilliant blue that offered no hint of the violence that had occurred 2 days prior. We parked a block away from the massive Victorian home to avoid the yellow police tape and the white OSHA vans parked out front. Sarah and I spent 3 hours walking up and down the manicured street, knocking on heavy mahogany doors and speaking to suspicious homeowners. No, I didn't see anything, a man in a golf shirt told us, peering through a cracked door. I heard the thunder, but I was in my basement. Sorry. I saw the ambulances, a woman walking a small poodle said, shaking her head. But I didn't hear any arguments. No, it was raining too hard. By 2 o'clock, we were exhausted and empty-handed. We stood on the sidewalk across the street from Mrs. Gable's house. I stared at the roof, my heart aching as I saw the scorch mark on the white fascia board near the ridge vent. It's useless, Sarah, I said, feeling incredibly defeated. No one was outside in that storm. Why would they be? It was a monsoon. Sarah didn't answer right away. She was staring intently at the massive oak tree standing in Mrs. Gable's front yard, right next to the driveway where the argument had taken place. Dad, Sarah said slowly, pointing her finger. What is that? I followed her gaze. Hanging from a thick, low branch of the oak tree, about 10 feet off the ground, and pointed directly at the driveway, was a small, ornate wooden birdhouse. It's a birdhouse, I replied, now confused. Mrs. Gable loves birds. She has feeders all over the backyard. Look closer, Sarah insisted, stepping off the curb and walking toward the edge of the property line. Look at the little circular hole where the birds are supposed to go in. I squinted against the bright afternoon sun. As I focused on the dark entrance of the small wooden box, a tiny, faint reflection of light caught my eye. It wasn't a hole leading into an empty space. It was a glass lens. Is that a camera? I whispered, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs. It's a smart birdhouse camera, Sarah said, her voice trembling with excitement. People use them to live stream birds hatching on their phones. It's motion activated, and most of them record audio directly to a cloud server. And it's pointed directly at the spot where Vince's truck was parked. We need to talk to Mrs. Gable right now, I said, suddenly feeling a massive surge of adrenaline. We quickly walked up the driveway, carefully avoiding the muddy patch near the rose bushes where Mateo had fallen. I knocked loudly on the heavy front door. It took a few minutes, but the door finally creaked open, revealing Mrs. Gable. She was a frail woman in her late 70s, wearing a thick cardigan despite the summer heat. Mr. Pendleton, she said softly, her eyes filled with sorrow. I am so incredibly sorry about what happened to that poor boy. The police have been here all morning. Mrs. Gable, I need to ask you something very important, I said urgently, pointing toward the oak tree. That birdhouse camera, is it yours? She nodded slowly. Yes. My grandson installed it for me last month so I could watch the robins nesting from my iPad. Why? Does it record sound? Sarah asked, stepping forward eagerly. Does it save the videos? Oh yes, Mrs. Gable replied, looking confused. It saves everything to my grandson's account online. I think it keeps the videos for a week before deleting them. Mrs. Gable, I pleaded, grabbing her frail hands gently. My boss is trying to frame me for Mateo's death. He is lying to the police, saying I forced him onto that roof. If that camera recorded our argument in the driveway before the lightning struck, it could save me from going to prison. Mrs. Gable's eyes widened in horror. He is trying to blame you, but I heard him yelling at you from my living room window. I saw him point up at the roof. You saw it? I gasped. I couldn't hear the exact words over the rain, but I saw him threatening you, she said firmly. Come inside, right now. We are calling my grandson. We are getting that video. Before we could even look at the footage from Mrs. Gable's smart birdhouse, I had a much heavier, entirely different obligation to fulfill. The next morning, I drove my beat-up work truck across town to a neighborhood where the houses were small, tightly packed together, and visibly worn. The sky was still a brilliant, mocking blue, making the devastating reality of the day feel even more incredibly wrong. I parked on a narrow street, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, holding a plain white envelope. Inside was $3,000 in cash, my entire emergency savings, and emptied from my checking account an hour ago. "Are you sure you want to do this right now, Dad?" Sarah asked softly, looking at the faded paint on the front door of the small duplex. "We don't have the video yet. If Vince's lawyers find out you came here, they might try to spin it as an admission of guilt or witness tampering." "I don't care what Vince's lawyers think," I said, my voice thick with an emotion I couldn't quite swallow. Mateo died because he was trying to feed his family. I was the last person to speak to him. I owe his wife the truth, and I owe her whatever I have left. We walked up the cracked concrete path and knocked gently on the peeling front door. It took several minutes before the door slowly opened. Elena Vargas was a young woman, likely in her mid-20s, but grief had aged her face overnight. Her dark eyes were swollen and deeply red, staring out at us with a mixture of exhaustion and profound confusion. A little girl, no older than 4, peeked shyly from behind her mother's legs, clutching a worn stuffed bear. "Mrs. Vargas?" I asked gently, removing my worn baseball cap. "My name is Joseph Pendleton. I was the foreman on the roof with your husband, Mateo." Elena's breath hitched, and a fresh wave of tears instantly welled in her eyes. She took a step back, her hand flying to her mouth. You were with him?" "Yes, ma'am," I said, my voice shaking. I looked down at the little girl, and my heart shattered into a million sharp, jagged pieces. "I am so incredibly sorry. I tried to stop him. I tried to save him." Elena opened the door wider, gesturing for us to come inside the small, incredibly neat living room. There were pictures of Mateo everywhere, smiling at a birthday party, holding his daughter, standing proudly next to an old, rusted car. The air smelled faintly of bleach and cheap coffee. "The police came," Elena whispered, sitting heavily on a worn floral sofa. She pulled her daughter into her lap, burying her face in the little girl's hair. "They said it was an accident. They said the boss told them Mateo ignored the safety warnings." "That is a lie," I said firmly, sitting in a wooden chair across from her. I leaned forward, looking her directly in the eyes. "Mateo did not ignore any warnings. Vince Cutler, the owner of the company, forced your husband up onto that roof in the middle of a lightning storm. He threatened to blackball him from ever working again if he didn't secure those tarps. I was fired for refusing to do it. Then Vince used Mateo's desperation against him." Elena stared at me, her eyes wide with shock and a sudden terrifying anger. "He forced him? For a tarp?" "Yes," I nodded, my chest tight. "Vince is trying to blame me, to save his company from a massive lawsuit and criminal charges. But I am not going to let him get away with it. I am going to prove what really happened in that driveway." Sarah stepped forward, gently placing the thick white envelope on the coffee table in front of Elena. "Mrs. Vargas," Sarah said softly, "this isn't from the company. This is from my father. It's his own money. We know it doesn't bring Mateo back, but we know you have immediate expenses, and Cutler Contracting isn't going to offer you a dime until they are forced to." Elena looked at the envelope, then up at me. Tears spilled over her cheeks, all landing on her daughter's head. "I don't know what to do," she sobbed brokenly. "We have nothing. He was just trying to buy her new shoes for preschool." "You don't have to do anything right now," I promised her, standing up. "Just take care of your little girl. I am going to make Vince Cutler pay for what he did to your family. I promise you." 2 days later, at 7 p.m., I sat in my living room, staring intently at Sarah's laptop screen. The room was silent except for the humming of the refrigerator. The district attorney had officially filed a subpoena for the company logbook earlier that afternoon, and Detective Russo had left 2 voicemails demanding I come down to the precinct for a formal interview the next morning. Vince's trap was closing rapidly, but Mrs. Gable's grandson, a tech-savvy college student named Mark, had finally managed to download the encrypted video files from the Smart Birdhouse cloud server. He had emailed them to Sarah just 20 minutes ago. "Okay, Dad," Sarah said, her fingers hovering nervously over the trackpad. "This is the file from Tuesday at 2:14 p.m., right when the storm hit." "Play it," I said, leaning closer to the screen. The video quality was incredibly high definition, recording in a wide-angle lens that captured the entire driveway and the front porch. The audio, unfortunately, was heavily distorted by the violent wind and the torrential rain pouring off the roof. We watched the video in tense silence. We saw my beat-up truck parked on the street. We saw Vince's gleaming Ford Raptor pull into the driveway. Then, the camera caught me climbing down the aluminum ladder, my clothes already soaked. "There's Vince," Sarah pointed at the screen as the owner stepped out of his truck with his massive golf umbrella, followed closely by Bull. We watched the argument unfold in pantomime. We saw me gesturing wildly at the churning sky, pointing at the heavy rain. We saw Vince step closer, pointing his finger aggressively at my chest. "Can you hear what he's saying?" I asked, straining my ears. Sarah boosted the volume to maximum, but the roar of the wind and rain drowned out the voices. It just looked like two men arguing. Then, Mateo's old sedan pulled up behind Vince's truck. We watched Mateo run through the rain, his clothes instantly soaked. "Here it comes," I whispered, my stomach knotting tightly. We watched Vince turn to Mateo, smiling cruelly. We saw him point his umbrella directly up at the 3-story roof. Now we saw me lunge forward, grabbing Mateo's arm, and Vince physically shoving me backward. "It's incredible," Sarah said, her eyes wide. "It shows everything. It shows you trying to stop him. It shows Vince pushing you away. But without the audio, it's just a visual argument," I argued, frustration boiling in my blood. "Vince's lawyers will just claim he was telling me to leave the property and that Mateo heroically volunteered to secure the roof. It doesn't prove he fired me or threatened Mateo." "Wait," Sarah said, pausing the video right as Vince shoved me. She leaned incredibly close to the screen, her eyes darting back and forth. "Look at Bull." I looked at the heavy-set foreman standing slightly behind Vince, under the edge of the porch awning. He wasn't involved in the physical altercation. He was just watching. "What about him?" I asked. "He's holding his phone," Sarah said, zooming in on the image. "He's not just holding it. He's got it angled slightly toward the argument. Dad, I think Bull was recording it." "Why would Bull record his boss acting like a monster?" I frowned, completely confused. "Because Bull is a sycophant, but he isn't stupid," Sarah explained rapidly, her legal mind working in overdrive. "He knows Vince is ruthless. He knows Vince would throw anyone under the bus to save himself. Bull probably recorded that argument as an insurance policy, just in case Vince ever tried to blame him for the bad call." I stared at the blurry image of the phone in Bull's hand. If that video existed, it would have crystal clear audio, recorded from just 10 feet away, perfectly protected from the wind by the porch awning. "So, Vince has the logbook," I said slowly, a dangerous plan beginning to form in my mind. "But Bull has the actual smoking gun, and Bull is terrifyingly loyal to whoever is paying him the most." "Exactly," Sarah smiled tightly. "We need to get Bull's phone." "No," I corrected her, standing up from the table. "We don't need to get his phone. We just need to make Vince think we have it." The next morning at 9 a.m. sharp, I walked into the local police precinct. The air inside smelled of stale coffee, industrial floor wax, and nervous sweat. I wasn't wearing my work boots or my flannel shirt. I wore a clean-pressed suit that I hadn't worn since my wife's funeral 5 years ago. Sarah walked confidently beside me, carrying a thick leather briefcase. "Mr. Pendleton," Detective Russo greeted us at the front desk, his expression unreadable, like he noted my suit and Sarah's professional demeanor. "I see you brought legal counsel. I am his daughter. And yes, I am a paralegal," Sarah stated firmly, handing the detective a business card from her firm. "My father is here voluntarily to clear up the false statements made by Mr. Cutler and Mr. Miller regarding the tragic death of Mateo Vargas." "Right this way," Russo said, leading us down a narrow hallway into a small, windowless interrogation room. The room was freezing cold, dominated by a scratched metal table and 3 plastic chairs. A small camera blinked a steady red light in the corner of the ceiling. "Have a seat," Russo said, sitting across from us and opening his notepad. "Mr. Pendleton, as you know, OSHA is investigating the fatality at the Gable residence. Mr. Cutler has provided a sworn statement, but corroborated by his foreman, Greg Miller, and the company logbook, stating that you were the acting foreman and safety officer on Tuesday. They claim you refused to halt work during the storm, directly leading to Mr. Vargas's death." "That is a complete fabrication, detective," I said calmly, looking Russo directly in the eyes. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't sound defensive. I sounded like a man who knew exactly what cards he held. I signed the logbook at 6 a.m., acknowledging my role for the shift. I continued steadily. At 2:10 p.m., recognizing the imminent danger of the lightning storm, I ordered my crew off the roof. I descended the ladder and was immediately confronted by Mr. Cutler, who had arrived on site. He explicitly ordered me to return to the roof. When I refused on safety grounds, nay, he fired me on the spot. Russo stopped writing and looked up, his brow furrowed. He fired you? Yes, I nodded. And then, in a display of gross negligence, he hired a day laborer, Mateo Vargas, right out of his vehicle and threatened to ruin his future employment prospects if he didn't immediately climb the ladder into the storm. Russo leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the metal table. That's a very different story, Mr. Pendleton. But, unfortunately, I have 2 witnesses and a signed document that contradict you entirely. Do you have any proof to back up these extremely serious allegations? Sarah opened her briefcase and pulled out a single, perfectly printed 8x10 photograph. She slid it across the metal table toward the detective. It was a still frame pulled from Mrs. Gable's Smart Birdhouse video. Nay, it clearly showed Vince Cutler violently shoving me backward away from Mateo, while pointing his golf umbrella aggressively up at the 3-story roof. Russo stared at the photograph for a long time. The silence in the small room was deafening. "Where did you get this?" Russo finally asked, his voice dropping an octave. "Mrs. Gable has a Smart Birdhouse camera pointing directly at the driveway," Sarah answered smoothly. "She has already provided the full video to our legal team. It clearly shows the physical altercation and my father attempting to stop Mr. Vargas from climbing the ladder." Russo studied the photo again, rubbing his jaw. "This is compelling, Ms. Pendleton, but it's just video. Without audio of the argument, Cutler's lawyers will argue he was removing a hostile, fired employee from the premises. That one that Vargas volunteered. It's muddy." "We are aware of that, Detective," I said, leaning forward slightly. "Which is why we aren't here to give you the video. We are here to tell you exactly where the audio is." Russo narrowed his eyes. "I'm listening." "Look at the background of the photograph," I said, pointing a steady finger at the heavy-set man standing under the porch awning. "Look closely at Greg Miller's right hand." Russo pulled the photo closer to his face. "He's holding a cell phone. He has it pointed at you." "Bull Miller recorded the entire argument," I stated with absolute certainty. "He recorded Vince firing me. He recorded Vince threatening Mateo. He recorded the exact orders that killed that young man. Miller is holding on to that video as blackmail material, or an insurance policy against his boss." Russo looked from the photo to me, his expression hardening into a predatory focus. "Are you certain about this?" "I am certain," I said, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. It was a massive bluff. I had no idea if Bull had actually been recording, but I knew exactly how to flush the truth out into the open. "And I am officially requesting that you secure a warrant for Greg Miller's cell phone immediately, before Vince Cutler realizes his own foreman is holding the smoking gun." Russo closed his notepad with a loud snap. "Wait here." He stood up and walked out of the interrogation room, leaving Sarah and me entirely alone in the freezing cold. We didn't speak. We just waited for the trap to spring. We sat in that freezing interrogation room for 2 agonizing hours. Sarah calmly reviewed her case notes, while I stared at the blinking red light on the camera, my mind racing. I was risking everything on a bluff built from a blurry pixel. If Bull hadn't been recording on that porch, I was going to prison. It was that simple. Finally, the heavy metal door clicked open. Detective Russo stepped inside, his face flushed, and dropped a black plastic evidence bag onto the metal table between us. Inside the clear bag was a bulky cell phone encased in a thick rubber case. "Is this it?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with anticipation. Russo sat down heavily, leaning back in his chair and rubbing his eyes exhaustedly. "That is Greg Miller's personal cell phone. We secured a rapid warrant based on the photographic evidence you provided from the Gable property." "Did he have the video?" I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs so loudly I thought Russo could hear it. The detective looked at me, his expression entirely unreadable. He slowly unzipped the evidence bag, pulled the phone out with a gloved hand, and tapped the screen a few times. He set the phone down on the metal table, right between us. "Yes," Russo said softly. He did, And it's exactly as you described. He hit play. The audio was startlingly clear, perfectly protected from the wind by Mrs. Gable's porch awning. We heard the violent crash of thunder, the loud pelting of rain on the aluminum roof, and then, unmistakably, Vince Cutler's voice ringing out with arrogant, terrifying clarity. "Are you refusing to work, Pendleton? Because I have a dozen guys who would happily take your paycheck today." I closed my eyes, the memory of that suffocating, humid air rushing back to me instantly. The recording continued, picking up my desperate warnings about the active lightning storm and OSHA regulations. "Then you're done. You're fired, Joseph. Pack up your tools and get off my site. Don't even bother asking for your final check until Friday." Sarah gripped my hand under the table, her fingernails digging slightly into my palm. She let out a long, shaky breath. The recording captured Mateo's arrival, his desperate plea for work, and Vince's cold, calculated manipulation of a young father's poverty. "A position just opened up. You want to work? You want to get paid today? See that roof? There are 3 loose tarps up there. Go secure them. Do that, and you have a full-time job." The audio clearly picked up my frantic attempt to stop Mateo, and shouting that the ridge vent was solid aluminum and a death trap. "Back off, Pendleton. You're trespassing now. Mateo, if you want this job, you climb that ladder right now. If you don't, I'll make sure no contractor in this county ever hires you. What's it gonna be?" The recording ended abruptly with a loud scuffling sound, as Bull presumably lowered the phone, right before the deafening, earth-shattering crack of lightning that killed Mateo. The small interrogation room was entirely silent, except for the humming of the fluorescent lights overhead. "Mr. Pendleton," Russo said softly, turning the phone off and sliding it back into the evidence bag. "I owe you an apology. You were completely framed by Mr. Cutler and his foreman. This audio, combined with the video from the birdhouse and your early departure from the logbook timeline, that is ironclad." "Thank you, Detective," I breathed out, the massive crushing weight of a prison sentence finally lifting off my chest. "However," Russo continued, his tone shifting into sharp, professional focus, "this is now an active homicide investigation into Vince Cutler for involuntary manslaughter and gross negligence resulting in death. I need you to understand that Cutler is incredibly wealthy, incredibly well-connected, and absolutely ruthless. He will try to buy his way out of this." "I know he will," I said, a cold, hard anger settling into my bones. "He values his money above human life. But I'm not just going to watch him get arrested, Detective. I want his entire empire dismantled. I want to make sure he never touches a hammer or hires another worker again." Russo nodded slowly, a small, innate approving smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "The district attorney is fast-tracking the arrest warrants for both Cutler and Miller right now. They don't know we have this phone yet. Miller handed it over at his house, completely panicked, but he hasn't called Cutler. So they still think I'm taking the fall," I said, a dangerous plan rapidly forming in my mind. "Exactly," Russo said. "They are operating under the assumption that their logbook alibi is holding up perfectly. Cutler is scheduled to hold a massive press conference at his corporate headquarters at 2 o'clock this afternoon, right alongside his high-priced legal team, to officially address the rogue actions of his former employee." I looked at Sarah, my eyes narrowing. "He's going to stand up in front of the cameras and publicly blame me for Mateo's death while trying to look like a grieving leader." "He's going to try," Sarah agreed, her eyes flashing with a fierce, predatory light. "Dad, we need to be at that press conference." The headquarters of Cutler Contracting was a massive modern glass and steel building situated on the affluent side of town. By 1:45 p.m., the front lobby was packed with local reporters, news vans, and nervous employees. Vince had set up a large podium in front of the sweeping floor-to-ceiling windows, complete with a massive company logo serving as a backdrop. Sarah and I slipped into the back of the crowded room, standing entirely unnoticed near the double-glass doors. I wore my dark suit, my face set in an expression of absolute, unyielding calm. At exactly 2 o'clock, Vince Cutler stepped up to the podium. He was flanked by 3 men in incredibly expensive suits, his high-powered defense attorneys. Vince wore a somber, dark tie, his face perfectly arranged into a mask of deep, practiced sorrow. He looked out over the flashing cameras and the sea of microphones. "Thank you all for coming," Vince began, his voice thick with fake emotion, reading smoothly from a prepared statement. This has been an incredibly dark week for the Cutler Contracting family. We are absolutely devastated by the tragic, senseless loss of a young man, Mateo Vargas, on one of our job sites last Tuesday. He paused perfectly, letting the cameras snap furiously. Our company prides itself on a rigorous, unyielding commitment to safety, Vince continued, shaking his head slowly. However, it has become painfully clear that on that tragic afternoon, our acting foreman, Joseph Pendleton, flagrantly violated our core safety protocols. Despite clear warnings of an approaching storm, Mr. Pendleton aggressively pushed his crew, forcing an inexperienced worker into a highly dangerous situation to meet a deadline. This rogue, negligent action cost a young man his life. A murmur rippled through the reporters. One journalist near the front raised her hand immediately. "Mr. Cutler, is your company facing fines from OSHA, and will Mr. Pendleton be facing criminal charges for his actions?" Vince leaned into the microphone, his expression hardening into righteous anger. "We are fully cooperating with OSHA and the local authorities to ensure Mr. Pendleton is held completely accountable for this tragedy. We have provided full documentation, including our signed daily logbooks, to the district attorney. We believe swift justice will be served, and Cutler Contracting will emerge stronger from this terrible betrayal of our values." "Are you sure about that, Vince?" I said loudly, my voice carrying clearly over the murmuring crowd. The entire room went dead silent. Every head turned toward the back of the lobby. The cameras instantly pivoted to focus on me as I slowly walked down the center aisle, directly toward the podium. Sarah followed closely behind me, holding her leather briefcase. Vince's somber mask instantly slipped. He gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles turning white, his eyes widening in pure shock. His lead attorney immediately stepped forward, pointing a manicured finger at me. Security," the attorney barked sharply. "Remove this man immediately. He is a disgruntled, terminated employee, and he is trespassing." Two large security guards moved quickly from the sides of the room, but before they could reach me, the heavy glass doors at the back of the lobby swung open violently. Detective Russo strode into the room, followed by 4 uniformed police officers. They moved with absolute, terrifying purpose, completely ignoring the security guards and the flashing cameras. "Step aside," Russo commanded, his voice echoing loudly through the massive, silent lobby. The crowd of reporters parted instantly, sensing the sudden, massive shift in power. Vince looked from me to the approaching police officers, a sudden, sheer panic finally breaking through his arrogant facade. "Detective Russo!" What is the meaning of this? We are holding a private press conference." "Not anymore, Mr. Cutler," Russo said coldly, walking right up to the podium. He didn't pull out handcuffs immediately. He pulled out a piece of paper. "I have a warrant for your immediate arrest." "Arrest?" Vince sputtered, taking a step back, his eyes darting frantically toward his lawyers. "On what charges? You have the logbook. Pendleton is the foreman. The charges are involuntary manslaughter, gross negligence resulting in death, witness tampering, and filing a false police report," Russo announced loudly, his voice booming over the frantic clicking of dozens of camera shutters. "We have secured explicit high-definition audio and video evidence directly contradicting your sworn statements, Mr. Cutler." The reporters erupted into shouting, immediately shoving microphones closer to the podium. "What evidence?" Vince demanded, his voice cracking, entirely losing his composure on live television. "That's impossible. It was pouring rain." "It turns out your own foreman, Greg Miller, was recording the entire argument on his cell phone." "Vince," I said smoothly, standing right next to the detective. I looked directly into Vince's terrified eyes. "He recorded you firing me, and he recorded you forcing Mateo onto that roof with a direct threat to his livelihood." Vince's face drained entirely of color. He looked like a man who had just been shot in the chest. He staggered backward, completely abandoned by his high-priced lawyers, who rapidly stepped away from him to avoid the cameras. "Turn around, Mr. Cutler, and put your hands behind your back," Russo ordered, gesturing to the officers. Right there, under the blazing lights of the cameras, the owner of Cutler Contracting was violently handcuffed. The arrogant, untouchable millionaire was frog-marched through his own lobby, past the flashing bulbs, his empire crumbling entirely into dust in a matter of seconds. I stood there in the silent aftermath, watching him disappear into the back of a police cruiser. I felt absolutely no joy, just a cold, profound sense of justice. 6 months later, the dust had finally settled. Vince Cutler took a plea deal for involuntary manslaughter and gross negligence to avoid a highly publicized trial. He was sentenced to 8 years in a federal penitentiary. Bull Miller, for his part in the cover-up and lying to the police, received 3 years. Cutler Contracting was completely liquidated to pay the massive, multi-million-dollar wrongful death settlement to Mateo's widow, Elena Vargas, and my own substantial settlement for wrongful termination and defamation. I didn't take my money and retire to a quiet beach. I took the payout and bought a small fleet of work trucks, rented a modest warehouse, and started a brand new company, Vanguard Roofing Cooperative. I made Elena Vargas a silent 50% partner. The profits from every single roof we laid ensured that her little girl would never want for anything, and her college tuition was fully funded before she even started kindergarten. I sat on my front porch on a cool, crisp autumn afternoon. The sky was a clear, brilliant blue, entirely free of storm clouds. I held a warm cup of coffee in my calloused hands, listening to the gentle rustling of the leaves in my front yard. Sarah was inside, laughing loudly at something on the television. It was peaceful, but the peace was hard-earned.